Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia, and dedicated to the proposition articulated first by Walter Lippmann during World War II, that a strong and balanced foreign policy is the indispensable shield of our democratic republic. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a Bulwark contributor, and a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center. My co-host, Eliot Cohen, the Robert E. Osgood Professor of Strategy at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, is here to join me after returning from a trip to the front to both Poland and to Ukraine. Eliot, welcome back.
Well, thank you. It's good to be back. I'm not quite sure I'd say the front, although we did get to see a good bit in Poland and Ukraine, and I'm happy to report back to you.
All right. Well, I want to get to that in a minute, both what you saw and found on your trip, as well as exploring with you your terrific piece in The Atlantic about a cornered Putin. I'll hold in abeyance a discussion about nuclear weapons, since Frank Miller and I testified together in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee yesterday about the future of nuclear strategy and policy. Maybe we'll get Frank, another co-conspirator, to come on and join us. We can talk nuclear weapons. Yeah, and in light of Putin's speech, this morning, which we can talk about, it would be particularly relevant. But before we go there, I want to just briefly talk about some good news, because mostly we talk about bad news on this podcast. But I want to lighten it up a little bit. First, tell me what you think about the fact that one of the first things out of the box that Prime Minister Liz Truss has done in the United Kingdom is announce a new review of British strategy and defense policy coordinated by our friend John Bew.
So I guess the good news there is, first, that the Brits are taking this all very seriously. But the other thing is that John Bew is leading it. So for our listeners, John Bew is a disgustingly young, brilliant historian. And even more disgustingly, he's actually a wonderful human being. And we should actually try to lure him onto the podcast. He's really a super nice guy. He's written several books which are fascinating. A biography of Castlereagh, the great early 19th century British statesman, a biography of Clement Attlee, Churchill's successor after World War II, and a book on realpolitik. And he's a deeply, deeply thoughtful guy. And I think there's something very reassuring about having about a country in which a first-rate historian can be involved in the shaping of strategy. And I think that augurs well. I'll also say that, to maybe link the next part of the podcast, one of the standout performances in this conflict has been by Great Britain. And the British have really been, in some ways, even ahead of us, but aggressively supporting Ukraine. There's not going to be any difference between Liz Truss and Boris Johnson. But, I do want to say that even though a lot of people have reservations or have had reservations about Boris Johnson, I do think he somehow channeled some little inner piece of Churchill. And immediately, he's been there several times. He's been eloquent in his support of Ukraine. And I think he's been eloquent in making the basic arguments for what British policy ought to be. I don't know about you, Eric, but as he was leaving Parliament, I was struck that he kind of gave his, it's not a last will and testament, because I think this guy has 9 lives, but part of his advice was stay close to the Americans. So it's a piece of traditional British statecraft. So all in all, it's very good news. I mean, the sad news, of course, is the passing of the Queen, but she had a very good run after 70 years, and it's actually, again, sort of impressive watching the British go through all the ceremonial of celebrating a quite extraordinary woman and then inaugurating a new reign. don't you think? I mean, I'm more of a sentimental royalist than you are.
Yeah, I'm a lot less sentimental about the royal family, and we'll see how King Charles does. I do think he's off to a good start. I've been impressed, and Liz Truss has been off to a good start. I had reservations about Liz Truss as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. I do think, first of all, keeping Ben Wallace on, the Secretary of State for Defense, who I think has been quite good, was very good in the Boris Johnson administration, and actually, frankly, after a succession of really lackluster ministers of defense, I think has been quite good in this circumstance. So I thought it was good that she kept him on. That was important. But also to see that our friend John is going to be leading this review, which I think is necessary. And the last review was only 18 months ago. But I think, as you say, the Brits understand circumstances have changed. And when circumstances have changed, strategy has to adjust. And so I think it's a very good sign all the way around. I do have to say one thing. I'm never quite sure why it was John wanted to do a biography of Clem Attlee, of whom Churchill once said, a modest little man who has much to be modest about.
Oh, it's not clear, I think, that he actually said that. He actually had a lot of regard for him during World War II.
When he was prime minister, right?
Right. So, yeah, but, I mean, all of us write different kinds of books on different subjects. I don't think we should be, I don't think we should be hypercritical. But it is good. An interesting contrast, Eric, may be with our own national defense strategy, which should finally drop fairly soon. And perhaps we should have a session which you and I, dissect it in exquisite detail, maybe a little bit more like vivisection than dissection. But
yeah, we'll get to that. Of course, I've been appointed to the new commission to review the NDS. We'll see whether that gets started. We're still waiting on one appointment on the Democratic side, and we'll see where that goes. The other piece of good news before we really dive into Ukraine has been the announcement by the Biden administration that the president has nominated, or is at least the intent to nominate, Lynn Tracy to be the United States ambassador to Russia. I think that's a terrific appointment, and I suspect you do too, but I'll let you speak for yourself.
Absolutely, and I'll just say, when I was counselor, a counselor of the Department of State, I frequently went to Pakistan, and I frequently went to Peshawar to take a look at the Northwest Frontier Province, and our Consul General there was Lynn Tracy, who was unflappable, had extraordinary connections there, and was courageous. One day she was pulling out of her home in Peshawar in her armored car, and it was riddled with, I think, like 30 bullets in an assassination attempt, and therefore thereafter she just kind of continued her job but slept in the office. And imperturbable, highly professional. Really, she's a wonderful pick, I think, for that position. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, very tough-minded. I think she's been deputy chief of mission in Moscow. She served there before, so she'll be terrific. Well, so much for the good news portion of this podcast. I'd like you to just first tell us, give us a sense of your impressions, both in Kyiv and in Warsaw. What did you find? And then I want to, drill into some of the things you wrote about in the Atlantic.
Yeah, and I want to get your views too on what's happening in Russia, since you were stationed there as a diplomat as well. So the trip was organized by PISM, P-I-S-M, which is the Polish foreign affairs think tank. It's government funded, so it's a bit different model than ours, which is extraordinarily well connected. There was a small group of us. It included people like Corey Shockey from the American Enterprise Institute, Michael O'Hanlon from Brookings, James Schur, who's a very expert student of Russia, Francois Heisbourg, one of the leading French figures in the national security field. So a small group. We got a wonderful visit with the Polish military and a visit to some of the bases on the Polish side of the border where a lot of the arms supplies to Ukraine are going. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. We also were accompanied by the Polish National Security Advisor and the Vice Foreign Minister, so it was a pretty high-level delegation, small. We went in by train at night. It had kind of a World War II feeling to it. And then we were in Kyiv. And in Kyiv, we visited Irpin, so we saw some of the battlefield there and some of the destruction and Ukrainians rebuilding and restarting their lives. We got a very good briefing from a very senior officer on the general staff, and we had a meeting with President Zelensky and also with the Ukrainian vice foreign minister. So, impressions. Let me start with Poland, because in some ways that's, when people say, well, what did you learn that was new? I can't say that there's a whole lot that I learned that was new, but one thing that was very striking was actually on the Polish side of the border, and that is I'd expected the base that we visited to be humming with activity, and it wasn't. And in fact, what we learned is that it's basically operating at about 60% of capacity. So it did not have the vibe that you and I both remember from going to Kandahar or some of our bases in the Persian Gulf. It's busy. There's stuff going on, but there could clearly be a lot more. And we also got quite a detailed briefing on the amount of material that's going to Ukraine. And my basic conclusion, which was reinforced by Kyiv, is not nearly enough. They need a lot of ammunition. They need surface-to-air missile systems. They need more long-range systems. They need more secure communications. And the Ukrainians were very clear with us about that. So I think the idea that they're getting everything they need is simply not true. Kyiv itself, what struck me about it is it felt very normal. A lot of traffic, fair number of people on the streets, restaurants open. Interestingly, you don't see a lot of heroic posters up there with figures of Ukrainian soldiers and so on. And I'm told that that's fairly deliberate, that they want, the part of what the Ukrainian leadership wants to do is to restore a sense of normalcy. The Ukrainian military, very, very impressive. And in general, I would say the mood was one of sober confidence and optimism, but not cockiness. They obviously had these great successes around Kharkiv, but they weren't taking things for granted. They were very clear about what they needed. A couple of the standout moments. One is when the general was asked, what has changed most in your military since 2014? This was a guy who I don't think is much given to big smiles. He said, we've moved away from the old Soviet command system. So we now, it's basically what the West would be called mission-oriented command now, where you tell your subordinates what to do, not how to do it. And he broke out into a big grin, and that clearly made him feel that they were going somewhere. I think they feel they have the Russians on the back foot. As you know, in the south, on the western bank of the Dnipro, you have the city of Kherson, which was really the major city that the Russians took early on. The bridges have all been smashed. The river crossings are under intense Ukrainian artillery fire, and there are 20,000 troops. And we asked him, what will happen there? He said, well, I'll just tell you, those soldiers aren't going back across that river. So I think they're optimistic. I think their technique will be different than around Kharkiv. So there was that and a number of other things. About Zelensky, what I would say is, you clearly feel in the presence of a remarkable personality. He was cheerful. He was somewhat humorous. He was very clear about what he felt they needed. He listened well, because we were asked to each give a piece of advice. He's an engaging guy. I have to say, he looked rested and relaxed, and he looked very fit. And so what that means is he's taking good care of himself, which I think is a tremendously important thing for a wartime leader to do. So that part I left reassured by.
So his hands weren't shaking, and he wasn't grabbing the edge of the table to steady his hands?
No, I think that would be the other guy.
We'll get to that.
So I came back reassured by that, but really concerned about the importance of continuing to pour in military aid at scale as fast as possible. There's an opening here. I don't know what you think about Putin's announcement that they're going to mobilize 300,000 reservists. I think they're going to have trouble generating much military capacity, but still, and I'm trying to make this argument in the Atlantic piece. You want the Ukrainians to win fast because winning slow means a lot more cities smashed, a lot more young men and women without limbs or with hideous burns or in graves, and it means more suffering for civilians. I have this dreadful feeling when they finally liberate Kherson, they'll find mass graves very much like those of Bucha and Izium.
Right, of course, and I agree with that, and I worry about that too. I want to get to Putin's speech, which I read intently, including in the Russian original. But before we do that, and related to what you were just saying, I mean, I think one of the reasons it's important to try and help them win as quickly as possible is the damage that's being done to the Ukrainian economy, and I worry a lot about that. I mean, we've got a limited amount of economic aid out of that $40 billion package that's helping, I think, $1 billion plus a month. We're giving essentially in direct budget support to the Ukrainian government, but that still leaves a big shortfall. They're printing money, which means they're going to have, an even bigger inflation than we've got in the U.S. and globally.
They're very sensitive to that, by the way. I mean, they I think one of there are two reasons why they want much better air defenses, particularly against UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, and cruise and ballistic missiles. And part of it is to give them freedom to maneuver on the ground, so it's for military purposes. But they want civilians to come back. They want the cities to be functioning. They want to prevent the Russians from doing what they're doing by smashing dams and flooding cities, and they know that they need to rebuild the economy. I thought the one piece of good news that I saw is that, if I'm not mistaken, the Department of Justice has approached Congress about being willing to take some of that $300 million in Russian reserves held in the United States and turn it into aid to Ukraine, which strikes me as an eminently sensible use of that money.
Yeah, no, I think that's going to be imperative. We're going to have to do that, I think. But I was just curious. I'm glad you say that they were very sensitive to using the military equipment to try and protect as much as they can of the civilian infrastructure and economy. But I just wanted to get a sense of how you felt people were holding up, how is the economy functioning, on a day-to-day basis. Did you get any sense of that while you were in?
No, I mean, we Kyiv seemed to be functioning, but we only saw some parts of it, and we were in a security bubble. So I could not fairly say that I really have a sense of economic activity, other than that, you just do get the sense that the Ukrainians are incredibly creative, that this is really a democratic society with a lot of people who are entrepreneurial. I think, one thing that we talked a bit about on the train on the way back, so Ukraine had its problems with corruption, also had its problems with oligarchs, but, you're going to have a whole bunch of veterans come back from this war. And I think what frequently happens in war is, in democratic societies, the veterans come back and they say, let's remember what kind of society we were fighting for. If you look at the civil rights movement in the United States, for example, part of it's driven by African American veterans coming back from World War II and saying, this isn't what and coming back to Jim Crow and things like that, and saying that is not what I fought for, and demanding, rightly, something else. And I think you may see something somewhat similar here too.
So let's talk a little bit. We will get to Putin and the Russians and mobilization and nuclear threats and all the rest of that. But you talked just now and in the Atlantic piece about getting them as much equipment as possible. What are the priorities? And particularly, both you and I have expressed on occasion the view that we should give them ATACMS. Let me play devil's advocate for a second and say, if you or I were sitting in the Pentagon today, knowing that the United States has only produced about 3,600 of these things to begin with, and about 500-600 of them have actually been fired by the U.S. before, leaving us about 3,000, and knowing that you might have a contingency with China in the Taiwan Strait, maybe sooner than you think. I mean, we had Hal Brands on here not long ago, basically suggesting could be not a 2030 or 2035 problem, but a 2027 or 2025 problem even. So does prudence maybe suggest you want to husband some of those resources yourself? And then the other question that goes with that is, you talked a little bit about there not being enough of a kind of wartime sense of urgency in the Atlantic piece, and I agree with that, of course. But there are some obstacles in terms of getting the signal to defense industry that they should, make massive investments in expanding plant capacity. And oh, by the way, all of them are extremely worried that they lack the trained workforce to produce all these munitions. So let me just throw all those, sort of complicating factors into it.
So, what I would say to my friend Undersecretary Edelman is, I understand all of your fears and anxieties and timidity, but I'm not going to let you get away with it.
That's the first time anyone accused me of that.
Well, you and I had an unusual relationship. So I would say a number of things. First thing I would say is their top priority is clearly anti-missile defense, anti-UAV defense for the reasons we discussed, but long-range strike is part of it. So here's a number of things. Let me first tackle the industrial mobilization thing. In the Atlantic piece, and right here, I'll be extremely critical of the Biden administration. Yes, there are all these constraints. I understand. But, it is amazing what the United States can do when you push aside the bureaucratic obstacles and you remove some of the things that constrain you from building things, and you throw money at it, and you say, we're going to get really smart people to do creative things. And the model for all this, of course, is the World War II mobilization, when, let us remember, we had the same shortages of highly sophisticated people. And guess what? You had, whether it was the automotive industry or the shipbuilding industry, they were churning out vast quantities of material with a workforce that was either totally unskilled or only semi-skilled that they had trained up. But what you needed to do was to make it easy to do that. And the problem is we're still operating on a peacetime kind of tempo. And there are things you can do. I mean, if you want people to invest in plants, you say, okay, we're going to pay for that. Or there's a number of things of that kind. Second thing I would say is, do you need to hold some of these in reserve in case of conflict with China? Of course. But the key, your old boss, Don Rumsfeld, said, what was the phrase? Low density, high demand.
Right.
He said that just means we didn't buy enough, right?
Right.
So then let's remember that that's the problem. We didn't buy enough, not that we shouldn't use it. But I would say strategically, a smashing Ukrainian victory over Russia and the eviction of the Russians from all of Ukrainian territory has tremendous strategic utility vis-a-vis China.
Yeah.
And, this is why I think it's so important for us to be able to think tactically and strategically at the same time. I think the message it sends to China about American will, about the resilience of democratic societies, is tremendously worth it. And it diminishes the value of their Russian ally, which is sort of dwindling into semi-vassalage.
Or how about their Russian-based military equipment, since almost everything in their inventory is either purchased from Russia or copied from Russian models.
So I think for that reason, it's actually a good use of it. And the final thing I would say is a TACMS packs a hell of a punch. And if you have a TACMS, you can do things like put the Kerch Bridge to Crimea, which is really their only serious supply route into Crimea from Russia, other than rail lines, which can be easily cut, puts that at risk. And we can, I think that one of the other points to make is the Ukrainians have been very good. When they said they won't use things to hit inside Russia, they haven't used HIMARS, for example.
No, they're using Russian stuff to go after stuff in Russia.
But with ATACMS, then all of the Russian rare areas in Ukraine are now at risk from things which are exquisitely precise and extraordinarily destructive. We still don't know I mean, I think there's one of the interesting mysteries, which will be, I'm sure, cleared up in time, is if you remember there were those really big craters in the ground in the Crimea, which wiped out about half of the Russian naval aviation in Crimea. And people were saying, well, that was done by special forces. It must have been really big guys to carry in, hundreds of kilograms of high explosive and place them exquisitely precisely. So and I don't know what system was used and all that, but that's the kind of destruction that you can inflict with ATACMS, and we should. So does that I hope reduce some of your, diminish the hand wringing and.
Right. No. The point you were getting to the point that I wanted to drive to, which is, the Gimler's rounds that they're using have multiple kind of warheads, but the ATACMS are a unitary warhead just with very high explosive behind it. So the numbers you have to give them, to your point, you don't have to give them a lot. I mean, you could even agree a priori on a target list and say, here's what, we agree you can use these for. And it could be things like the Kerch Bridge, except I don't think the administration will give it to them for the Kerch Bridge because the administration has decided that, Crimea, the Russians regard as Russia. Therefore, if you attack Russia, you're inviting World War III. Now, that's despite the fact that the formal policy of the United States of America remains that we do not recognize the Russian annexation of Crimea. We still regard it as part of Ukraine. And this is now implicated in what Putin just announced, because if Putin has these sham referenda in parts of Lugansk and Donbass and Donetsk and the Donbass, and says, well, this is Russia now, so any American systems used to attack this is attacking Russia, and then I'm going to respond with a nuclear attack, but we're out of business.
Yeah, well, I think
can't let that stand. So
yeah, you and I have, I think, been expressed our frustrations about this repeatedly. That we foolishly say things that, of course, the Russians play back at us. One of the things I say in the Atlantic piece, if we said, look, at all costs we have to prevent the Russians from painting their tanks neon yellow, you can be sure that next day there'd be a parade of 100 tanks in Red Square with 100 barrels of neon yellow paint, and somebody saying, you push us one step further and we're going to begin painting all these tanks neon yellow. It's extremely foolish and self-destructive. But since you mentioned Putin, shouldn't we shift to that? And since you're the Russian speaker and you're the guy who served in Moscow, I would be really curious, what do you take away from that? I just read it in English translation rather hastily. But sounds like you've read it a lot more carefully. What do you take away from that, Eric?
So look, it's a speech which both obscures and reveals, right? So I think it reveals how dire the situation is from his point of view, how panicked the Russians are. Ann Applebaum has a piece in the Atlantic that just posted before we came on about how the Kremlin is in disarray, obviously, because he scheduled the speech for last night, was all set to go, and then suddenly didn't happen. And then suddenly it appeared this morning at 9:00 in the morning, which is not the normal time that you have a, broadcast speech to the nation, and it was taped. So something was going on, last night. We don't know exactly what is behind that. In some senses, the speech is, so detached from the reality of what's happened, that it's in a way almost troubling, because it projects almost everything that he is actually doing and accuses Ukraine and the West of being the authors of that. So it's attacking civilian infrastructure, committing human rights abuses, all of the stuff that he's actually doing, trying to extirpate, national sovereignty. I mean, it's literally, projection of everything that he's doing in Ukraine onto, his adversaries. That's the first thing that struck me. The second thing is on the on the nuclear threats, right? He talks about, first of all, he says things that are just manifestly untrue. I mean, the mendacity of the speech is really striking. For instance, that Western officials, US and NATO officials, are constantly talking about using nuclear weapons against, Russia. The only one they're constantly talking about using nuclear weapons is Putin and some of his colleagues on Russian state TV. I mean, this is not a discourse that's going on in the West at all. So
But do you think he believes that, Eric? Or I mean that it,
I think that's for domestic consumption. I don't believe that he believes that. I think it's for domestic consumption. But when he issues the nuclear threat and says, this is not a bluff, by the way, there is a Russian word for it, bluff. To me, that's a tell. When you say, I'm going to do X and I'm not bluffing, it suggests that really you are. Because if you weren't, you wouldn't have to say it. So I do think that there is an element, precisely of what you say in the Atlantic piece, which is they know this is a neuralgic point, and I thought it was best expressed today by, I think it was Matt Harris of the Royal United Services Institute in an article in the Wall Street Journal, in which he said, look, Putin absolutely understands that the use of nuclear weapons is a catastrophic cataclysm for Russia and for him personally. That being said, we need to take all nuclear threats seriously, but we can't be paralyzed every time somebody, says, oh, we might use nuclear weapons. For what? To do what? I mean, I was asked by Senator Angus King yesterday in the Senate Armed Services Committee this very question. What might Putin do? And my answer was, look, we don't know because it's all in Putin's mind. How would they use a nuclear weapon? He said. If you read Russian doctrine on nuclear weapons use, there's a lot of talk about using it across a kind of spectrum of uses, including demonstration shots. So would they, do a demonstration shot over the Black Sea or something? A high altitude airburst. That's, I think, a possibility. It would scare the crap out of everybody in Europe and the United States. It would, fry electronics all through southern Ukraine and Turkey and around the Black Sea basin, including in Russia. But, never mind. Could they use a really low yield weapon? On a railroad junction, a key railroad junction in Ukraine? Yes, I think they could. I mean, do they need to? No, because they can probably use a conventional munition against it. But I mean, that would be a target that you could imagine them using. Although I did counsel people in the hearing that, this whole notion of tactical and strategic nuclear weapons, even very low yield weapons, I think is literally nonsense. And it's really an artifact of arms control, what we could count, from national technical means of surveillance, as opposed to, anything that means anything. I described the distinction between tactical and strategic nuclear weapons is the, distance of the square root of your distance from the weapon. So if you're very far away, it's tactical. But if it happens to fall on you, it's very strategic.
yeah, I think that's a good point.
Just to tie this off, I mean, we can't be paralyzed by this. We have to take it seriously. And just the final thing I would say is it drives me crazy when former officials or current U.S. government officials hiding behind a cloak of anonymity in the press say, well, we don't have to respond with a nuclear weapon if they do that. We could use conventional means to do that. I have to say, President Biden, I think, has it right. The message needs to be, don't do it because you will change the character of warfare, as the president said to Scott Pelley on 60 Minutes on Sunday night, and rely on what late Thomas Schelling in Strategy of Conflict called the risk that leaves something to chance, letting them know that if they do this, it's going to lead everybody down a road that nobody knows what the end of, and it could end really badly for them. You don't have, does that mean that I recommend that the president actually have a nuclear response if they do it? Not necessarily, but we shouldn't talk about not doing it, because that frankly makes it more likely that he'll do it.
So, I think maybe a topic for another session is, why do all these really smart people with degrees from Harvard and Yale Law School
Say such dumb things.
make such really rudimentary mistakes when you're talking about dealing with this kind of regime, where it should be clear to an 11-year-old that you don't tell them what you're afraid of. You don't. I mean, this is it's almost like dealing with a playground bully. You don't tell the playground bully what you're really afraid of him doing to you. I mean, it's very strange. I think if I could shift a little bit in the announcement, the substance of it. So they say they're gonna mobilize 300,000 reservists. Now, of course, first thing is important for our listeners to know that they don't have a reserve system the way the United States or Finland or Israel does. These are not people who've been in any kind of training or any kind of organized units.
It's not a ready reserve.
Yeah, it's people who've gone through military service of some kind, and that's different. They probably don't. They may not have the equipment for them. They almost certainly don't have the trained officers. They're going to farm this out to the regional governors, so you can be quite sure there'll be people buying their way out of this. All the planes out of Russia are booked. With people trying to get
Peskov's son. Did you see that?
Oh, I saw that where they pranked him. They called him, said we wanted to report to the commissariat. So, I've got to fix this at a different level.
Yeah, right.
But here's the thing that I found interesting about this. I mean, the most obvious thing to do would be not to try to begin scarfing up people who are, combat veterans 20 years ago, but to send conscripts, probably in some ways better trained, younger. And he's clearly not willing to do that. I mean, in fact, he explicitly says in the speech that they're not going to send conscripts. And I find that fascinating, because it seems to me to indicate that he still is afraid of the popular reaction. There were demonstrations in St. Petersburg and Moscow and Novosibirsk and other big cities.
Yeah, a lot of places. More than I thought.
More than I expected. So on the one hand, he's afraid of the popular reaction, and it's clear that people may not have cared about this thing, but they don't want their kid going to go fight in this stupid war and get killed by the Ukrainians. So on the one hand, there's that. On the other hand, there's that body of opinion that's represented by, some of the people in the military blogging channels that you see on Telegram, or above all, the kind of the people who appear on the Russian sort of talk news shows. They're really a quite extraordinary collection of vampires and ghouls. And I don't mean that in a complimentary sense. Who...
Is there a complimentary sense of calling someone a vampire and ghoul? I don't know.
Well,
anyway,
that's a point to discuss later on, I suppose. But I'm sure they represent a real body of opinion. And some of it is, to be serious, it's very chilling. You can follow some of this on Twitter. There's a wonderful reporter, Julia Davis, who's at the Daily Beast, who translates, these characters. And you see the clips. They are preaching genocide. I mean, that's the only word you can you can properly use. And I have to think that they represent something in the system.
Yeah.
I don't think this is just them shooting their mouths off. So it does seem to me that there's a chance that Putin's getting squeezed. And then the final source of pressure that he must be feeling is, Chinese are not really backing him up. Modi kind of rebukes him publicly. Erdogan says Crimea, that's entirely Ukrainian.
Yeah.
I mean,
not to mention the Azeris are using, the weakness of, Russian troops being pulled out of Armenia to restart the war in the Caucasus. The Russian, quote, peacekeepers who were pulled out of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, the Kyrgyz and the Tajiks are going at it. The Kazakhs are, he's got a massive set of problems. Let me try a theory out about the mobilization on you. I have got my own views about this. So first of all, they lack the infrastructure to actually have a full national mobilization, because they used to have that in the Soviet era, because as you well remember, Soviet divisions in those days were heavily under strength and would be, have a national mobilization in time of crisis or war, where people would fall in and then be, they would fall in on sets of equipment that existed for, divisions that were essentially shells, right? They've dismantled all that in the 1990s. It was too expensive to maintain that. So they couldn't even have a national mobilization. You're, of course, right. He's very afraid of the societal blowback. Shoigu, for instance, went on television immediately afterwards and clarified that, well, if you're a student studying, we're not going to pull you out of your studies. We're only looking for people who have like specific kinds of military experience from previous service, and we're going to make them, go forward. Look, you and I have been talking for months on this podcast about the prospect that the Russian military might just collapse, that the army might just collapse in Ukraine. I think what this limited mobilization is all about is trying to fill the gaps in the units that they have to keep them from crumbling between now and the winter, because otherwise you might have a catastrophic collapse and failure. And I think that's what this is all about. It's a gap filling measure. And as you say, it's not going to yield them any real, because of the inability to train or provide equipment in any real time, and because they're all going to be demoralized. None of these people want to go. I mean, the biggest Google search, in Russia yesterday was, how do I get out of Russia? And all the, one-way flights out of Russia were booked out. They're now giving instructions to the airlines: don't book a ticket for anybody military age between 18 and 65. If they're
So I heard that one of the other popular search terms was, how do I break my arm at home? But
there you go.
There's a long tradition of that. I mean, people used to shoot their big toe off.
Right.
Rather than be drafted into the Russian army. I think it's right. I guess just to amend it a little bit, I think part of this is because they tried to take over a country bigger than France with an initial invasion force of less than 200,000, which was way, way too small. I think they also, they still have it's a manpower heavy theory of war. They just haven't resourced it. So one of the things Ukrainians said to us is, the way they do reconnaissance is what we would call a movement to contact. You just send a whole bunch of infantrymen and you see, in which direction the fewest of them get killed, and you try there. And then when you're stopped, you try somewhere else. But there isn't a whole lot of military.
It's not reconnaissance by fire. It's reconnaissance by cannon fodder.
Yeah. Now, I think the other thing is, as those people come in, you're right, they'll be demoralized, and they will quickly be infected with fear by the people who are already there. I mean, those kinds of dynamics, which you usually see at the end of a long war, can be quite powerful. I believe in 1918, fresh troops going to the front on the German side, on the Western Front, faced crowds of soldiers who were already there, calling them scabs and strikebreakers, which can't have been particularly encouraging for them. I think that, though, I would push it even further. They may think that this thing will stop during the winter. I'm not convinced that the Ukrainians will let them do that. And I also think that, given what we know about corruption and its effect on the Russian supply system, I think your chances of having a reasonably warm parka and mittens and stuff like that are probably higher on the Ukrainian side than on the Russian side. So I think you're going to have a lot of quite miserable people, and they'll be having trench foot and stuff like that. And I also finally think that the Ukrainians will continue to be adroit in how they chew these people up. I mean, our friend Mick Ryan, retired Australian two-star, who ran their Australian Defence College, calls it a strategy of corrosion.
Yep.
And I think that's a very good way of describing it. So you're right. It feels kind of desperate. It feels inadequate. And the result is a crisis. I mean, we don't have a whole lot of time left. So let me ask you a question. So it's the old "tell me how this ends." I mean, there is Putin
I was going
under
to ask you
enormous
that.
under enormous pressure in the way that
Yeah.
we've described, internally from different dimensions, externally, war going very badly, not likely to go well. A West that's much more united than he ever could have suspected. By the winter, you know, on current trends, it'll look like part of his theory of victory was that the Europeans would cave, and they're not caving. What happens to him, and where do we go from there?
I don't have a crystal ball and can't really tell you how it ends. I mean, I think it's going to be very difficult. He says now, I mean, it is interesting. He says he is willing to negotiate. This is what he's been saying now to Xi and Modi and others. We're willing to negotiate. It's the Ukrainians who won't negotiate, which is, I mean, it's another lie, essentially. I mean, there's a glimmer. I mean, there's a small grain of truth in it, in the sense that right now the Ukrainians don't see a whole lot of incentive to negotiate. But we know from a recent AP report that Dmitry Kozak, who is one of Putin's cronies and Ukrainian-born, negotiated a deal with the Ukrainians before February 24th, in which the Ukrainians promised that they wouldn't apply for NATO membership, and Putin blew it off. He wasn't interested, which tells you, by the way, how much this is about NATO membership. This is about elimination of Ukraine. And as you were saying, the genocidal eliminationist rhetoric that you see on Russia Today and Channel One are symptomatic of what's behind all this. That's what's really behind all this. Look, I think he could be replaced at some point. There was a lot of discussion on Russian TV last week after the Ukrainian breakthroughs in Lugansk. For heads on Putin's desk, someone has to pay for this. If only the Tsar knew. Of course, this was the Tsar's doing, but if Shoigu or Gerasimov or some others are going to be made scapegoats for this, they may decide they may not want to peacefully go off and be scapegoats. My fear is, if he's replaced, it'll be replaced by somebody who's even, worse or no better. But probably someone who may not be able to keep all the balls in the air of this, kind of corrupt kleptocratic system. Putin's real genius is not as a strategist. It's as someone who can make this corrupt system work and keep going. That's his real genius. The other possibility that we've discussed repeatedly on Shielded Republic is that the Russian military just crumbles and goes away. Um, Putin may try and have, these rump referenda and then say that's Russia and basta, let's negotiate now. I mean, that's a possibility. You might get enough pressure from the Europeans and others, maybe even some inside this administration, who would like to see this end, who might push the Ukrainians to do that. I mean, you argue very strongly against that in your Atlantic piece, and I agree with you. It would be foolish, to do this. But I could imagine it happening over time, particularly if we get into the winter and gas prices are going up and there's a lot more inflation, et cetera. So it could be any one of those. I just don't know which way it'll go.
My last thought is there could just be chaos for a while, where you have different governments coming and going, and a lot of forces tearing at it. I do think, though, the thing we won't be able to get away from is we're going to have to be kind of on our guard against a revanchist Russia for decades to come. And that really is going to require some very serious strategic rethinking on our part, which maybe should be the subject of another podcast down the road, particularly once we have the new national defense strategy to dissect.
Happy to dig into that with you. I would leave everybody with one final thought. There was one thing that was very striking in the speech by Putin. He says their objective is not just to contain and defeat Russia and limit its sovereignty. It's to break Russia up into a bunch of different smaller states that will be at war with one another forever, because of their different ethnic, linguistic, composition. I mean, hundreds of nationalities and languages in Russia. It's not a natural nation state. I don't rule out that if you get this kind of chaotic situation at the top that you were discussing in Russia, that the whole thing does fall apart and break up, and it's happened before in Russian history a couple of times.
It certainly has.
Well, on that cheery note, we started on a high, happy note, but inevitably we get back to something even less cheery, and that will call it a day for Shield of the Republic today. But Eliot, thank you for sharing your firsthand impressions, just back from, if not the front, at least, if not the line of contact, at least the the theater. So we're glad.
Well, thank you, and I'll just say we default to our usual dark view of human nature and the prospects for international affairs, and I'm sure it's what our listeners expect of us. We'll see you next time.